Good day, everyone. I'm Bob Ackerman, the editor-in-chief of Signal Magazine, and I'd like to welcome you to our Signal Magazine webinar titled Modernizing Data Protection. As online data became ubiquitous, managing it became as important an endeavor as amassing and storing it. A host of issues surround data management, not the least of which is security. But many others loom as data increases exponentially, both in size and in importance. In today's webinar, which is sponsored by Veritas and DLT, two experts will frame the problem and explore solutions. These may range from data governance to multi-cloud data management and software-defined storage. Our two experts will discuss these points in a steady conversation punctuated by questions. Today's first presenter is Jonathan Alboum, Chief Technology Officer, U.S. Public Sector, Veritas Technologies. Jonathan has served in digital transformation roles in both the private and public sectors. He has been CIO for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, where he led the development of the department's digital modernization strategy. He also worked at GSA and the Federal Acquisition Service. In the private sector, he worked as a management consultant for PricewaterhouseCoopers and Ventura Corporation. Our second presenter is Sherry Bennett, DLT's Chief Data Scientist. Sherry has spent years building predictive models for startup companies, providing data analytical services for major corporations, and creating a global business intelligence and data science team for academia. Prior to joining DLT, she served as the Chief Data Officer at the University of Maryland University College, the largest online public university in the United States. So with that, I'd like to ask Jonathan about data management. Jonathan, what are the biggest challenges confronting IT organizations today?
Well, thanks, Bob. It's great to be here. So as I have a chance to meet with our customers and talk with CIOs and IT executives, I routinely hear that they have challenges with data governance. The biggest problem that I hear about and talk about is how often people don't understand what all of their data is, where all of their data is. There are always many copies of data, and the opportunity to prevent that data from being exfiltrated in the event of a cyber attack directly relates to the amount of data that you can protect and secure on your network. If you don't know that data exists on your network, it's very hard to secure it. So having some governance, some program that allows for classification of data, an understanding of where that data is and how it's used is really very important. Who owns it? And those kinds of questions come up routinely. The lack of data governance or the challenges around data governance, those things are really exacerbated by this very strong desire that agencies and organizations have to move into cloud technologies. What I see is organizations really aren't moving completely out of their data center, but they're using the cloud as a tool to enhance their data center, moving to a very hybrid kind of environment and across multiple clouds. So in a hybrid, a multi-cloud environment, understanding what your data is and where it is and having a strategy to manage it is really critical. And just layer on top of that, traditional requirements for business continuity or getting a handle on storage. All of those things are very hard when 80% of our data is unstructured, when data volumes are exploding, and organizations are constantly fighting the next cybersecurity battle.
Sherry, how do you get your arms around what data exists in your environment?
That's a really excellent question, and thank you. I'm happy to be here today with both of you. I think the issue that most organizations are confronting right now is just what Jonathan said, is they don't know what a lot of their data assets are. They have a lot of data. They're trying to get their arms around it and understand what's valuable, what's not valuable. Data governance is certainly one of the issues that complicates this. If you don't have an organization set up with roles and responsibilities about who owns the data, who's defining the data, who has access, the security around it, that complicates things. But one level up, which most organizations have not begun to do, is set a data strategy. And data governance would be one of the components of a data strategy. Typically a CIO, CTO, but more often than not a chief data officer, which this role is getting more acceptance and popularity in the federal sector space, is an individual who would set out to think about a data strategy for an organization. And that's where you would begin to think about not only what data you have, but how it's being used, because the requirements are very critical to understanding what information is valuable and which ones should be used. And that would lead to discussions about and planning around where data should be stored in the cloud, in a hybrid environment, on-prem, virtually, these sorts of things.
Jonathan, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in what you just said. The opportunity, I think, long term is to be able to automate some of those decisions. And if you can classify your data and you can understand that this particular data set has PII data in it, or this data set has protected health information, or this isn't some special class of data, and you have those classifications in place and you have appropriate technology to automate storage decisions, you can move it to a different class of storage over time. You can use classification technology to know the last time the data was touched. So if it's a data set that has PII and hasn't been touched in 3 years, you can move it to a secondary storage with a certain level of security. If it's not some sort of protected class of data, has been touched in 2 years, you can move it to another kind of storage. Perhaps you can recognize other attributes of that data and decide that it's not critical to the organization, and after 3 years or 7 years, some period of time, you can actually delete the data, get it off of your network and get it out of your environment because you no longer need it. So I often hear about the need to automate and orchestrate, those kinds of activities. But you're doing it in the dark, really, if you haven't done those core data governance activities around data classification and roles and responsibilities, and some kind of basic understanding about who has access to what data in an organization. Also, part of what I think comes out of the activities you're describing is establishing some kind of culture of data stewardship. Yep. You have a lot of people who touch data in an organization. They either create it or they're reviewing it. They're augmenting it, they send it around, they make copies of it. Some of those activities are good and they drive the mission forward. Some of them, result in copies of data being stored in locations where they shouldn't be stored, or in creating confusion or creating more risk than is necessary. Because the reality is that someone will one day get into a network, and when they're there and hunting around for data, you want to give them as little data to find as possible. So all those copies of data create undue risk. And I really think it's important for leaders in agencies, or the CDO or Chief Information Officer, Chief Information Security Officer, these roles, to have programs around understanding and finding data. And especially as we move to the cloud, the basic analogy, one I often use, is if you're going to move to a new home, you're going to look through everything that you have, and you're going to throw some things out, you're going to pack some things up and move it to storage.
Definitely throw things out, yeah.
Yeah, right? So as people move to the cloud, you just can't pick up everything that you have in an old system or an old environment and move it. You're going to be paying a lot of money to do that, and you're missing a great opportunity to really get your data house in order.
Yep. Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything you said. I think for a lot of organizations, especially in the public sector, is where to start, how to start. And you raised the issue about compliance and regulation, and I think in a number of ways that's exactly where you should start. There's I think Gartner said there's over 80% of the data that we have today, which is growing rapidly, 80% of it's unstructured. And a lot of organizations know that a majority of that has some personal identifiable information, but they don't know where exactly. And I've heard many CIOs in different agencies say, we've got over 600 systems, we're using them for reporting, but I don't know what's in every system, and we don't really need all these systems. So I think, really getting your arms around what data is personal, has personal identifiable information and has some compliance or regulatory requirements around it. You got to get your hands around that fast. And if that's certainly where a lot of the cyber threat comes into play. I think Cyberware Ventures quoted something in a recent article that over $11.5 billion in ransomware attacks are going to occur next year. That's quite a bit. And if organizations don't know where that information is, where it's located, and securing it, that can be quite a risk.
Yeah. There's an even more practical requirement, I think, when you look at the general data protection regulations in the EU. Whether or not they exactly apply in the government, I think is a little bit irrelevant, because California's started a new law around privacy, and I think there's a new privacy bill being debated in Congress now, so we'll have some kind of privacy regulation in the United States eventually. I think most people seem to think that will occur. If you just look at GDPR as a model, there's a right to be forgotten. So if you're a customer of an organization, or maybe a customer of an agency, conceptually, you can say, I no longer want to be in your databases. I don't want to be part of this organization any longer, so please delete me.
Yeah.
And if you're going to delete someone's information, you're going to do it per the regulations, you're going to delete all their information, which means you have to get it out of all those copies.
Right.
Which means you have to get it out of the CRM system, which means you have to get it out of maybe the financial system or other operational systems. Sherry, to your point, if organizations are saying we have these systems, we don't know what data's in them or how they work together, or, we don't know what's just the right data, it's very difficult to meet those requirements. And I think I saw an article just the other day that Google had a large fine against it in a GDPR finding.
Yeah.
That might just be the first of many. So there's very practical rationale for doing what we're doing. It takes money to do these kinds of activities, but in the end, I truly believe that it will save money if you think about it over the long run. One, you'll get better value out of your data, and two, you'll have, again, better opportunity to be compliant with new and emerging regulations.
Yep, totally agree. Could we talk a little bit about moving to the cloud and the risks there?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a cloud expert, but it seems to me, because there's not a lot of organizations are just realizing that there's a priority that should be placed on sort of understanding what their data is, managing it, and setting up councils or organizations that really understand what information is being used by the business. And it seems to me a lot of organizations, when they're moving to the cloud, and I think a majority, I was reading something in the newspaper the other day, I think 93% of organizations or in their IT roadmaps have a strategic plan to move to the cloud. Which sounds great, that's modernization, right? But doing that, requires talent and understanding about the architecture, the data services that you need, what really should go to the cloud in terms of infrastructure and computing capacity versus staying on premise. Mm-hmm. You can't do everything all at once, you can't boil the ocean, so setting out a plan that sort of takes you, gets it started. In your experience, do you have some comments there?
Yeah, going to the cloud is not something that you can do lightly. Whether it's a data management program to understand the data that you're going to move to the cloud, or just understanding that as you integrate cloud technologies into your operation, you're effectively extending your data center. Or you can think about it as you're acquiring data center capabilities for some of your systems, infrastructure service, if you will, from a provider. But that provider's not going to do everything for you in the new environment. You're not giving up your responsibilities to protect your data. If you look at fairly standard cloud service provider agreements, they often state that the customer is responsible for protecting their data, for securing their data, for making backups and other kinds of very standard basic IT operational responsibilities. So, cloud providers provide snapshots and some related technologies and some data protection, but it may not meet your requirements. So I think it's really important that as you're moving to the cloud, as you have those architecture conversations, which you certainly need to have, you're also thinking about, well, how do we operate in this new environment? Likewise, a cloud service provider has an SLA around their infrastructure.
Yep.
And they'll bring their infrastructure back up quickly, but if you've moved an application to the cloud, you moved it and it is maybe not cloud ready, if you will, or if the architecture of that application doesn't necessarily support failover in a way that the cloud technologies require, you might be able to bring that environment back up, but bringing that application back up could take a long period of time. So there's still a business continuity requirement. And cloud is a very important and very good technology, and it is part of our modernization plans, but it's not a panacea. And you have to remember that there are some responsibilities that you're gonna maintain, and you have to remember that clouds do go down. So
right, yeah.
Business continuity is something that's very important. I'd say lastly, because we were talking about regulation before, you're still responsible for understanding what your data is and being able to find it if there's a FOIA or an e-discovery or records management requirement. The privacy regulations we've been discussing are still your responsibility as the operator. They're not the cloud provider's responsibility. So I think in addition to jumping into the cloud because it feels like the right thing to do because a lot of people are doing it, and you could go too fast if you don't have a cloud architect or other key roles on your team, it's very easy to forget that you have some of these other responsibilities. And as you find them, sometimes that cost differentiator, might cost less theoretically to be in the cloud, but as you add in these related responsibilities, I think that cost evens out. So cloud's an important, once again, cloud's a very important technology, and I think it fits into most CIO's plans, and it can fit in, I think, very economically, but you need to do it with some forethought and some real planning, as Sherry's described.
Yeah, absolutely.
Most of the experts with whom I've spoken have said that much of the cloud constructs will be hybrids, and that most people are now moving to these hybrids. The hybrids are likely to evolve with time, both in form and function, and very quickly. So how do you secure them effectively while meeting privacy and government regulations that exist if you're a customer who is using hybrid cloud infrastructure?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good follow-on question, what we were just describing. If if you have certain security controls in your data center that you've been operating with for a long period of time, and your application maybe has an authority to operate based on these security controls, it's your responsibility as the operator of that application to make sure that they extend into the cloud, especially if that application's operating, as you say, in a hybrid manner in your data center and in the cloud. Perhaps you're extending out to the cloud to get extra compute or to to have more capacity during a busy season. You can't do that without ensuring that you're maintaining a consistent approach to securing your application. So again, I think it goes to thinking about architecture. I think it goes to thinking about your data. I think it extends to conversation with the business owners of that application about maybe certain design considerations or certain considerations about how you interact with the cloud. So your security office is going to be involved as well. So it becomes a comprehensive conversation. And when you're talking across the organization like that, I really believe you have a really good chance to have a good security program at that point.
And to your point, I think hybrid's going to be a norm. You're not going to have a scenario where everything is in the cloud or everything stays on-prem. That's just a reality, especially in the public sector space. Modernizing and moving to the cloud, it's just a reality that you can't do everything at once, and so you have to think about what are the things that add the most value in terms of accomplishing your mission goals and the services that you're providing to your constituents or stakeholders. What are those key things that you move first that add the value and demonstrate that you're actually doing this in a secure way where risks are mitigated.
Yeah, if I could just jump in, I think
Sure.
understanding the use cases that you want to utilize the cloud for is very important. It may be running an application, but I see a lot of customers and a lot of CIOs looking at the cloud as as a storage solution in some cases. So
Right.
You might have primary storage, and then there's a secondary storage for backups or other data that you want to keep long term. But then there's other data that you need to keep forever. You're not accessing. So instead of storing that even on your secondary storage, you can push it out to a cloud service provider into an Amazon Glacier type solution, which is cheap and deep storage. It's great to put it in there. If you have to get it out, it might be complicated necessarily. So you have to make those decisions. Again,
nobody
with a lot.
Nobody wants to get rid of data.
Right. Nobody wants to get rid of data, but for that stuff that you just feel that is so necessary to keep, cloud can be an excellent repository for that information. But again, it goes back to the beginning of our conversation, taking the time to classify your data, understand what it is, and be able to, with a sense of confidence, take data that you're unlikely to touch in the near future and or even in the long term, and move it to a repository in a cloud provider that's secure and less expensive. And that's an excellent way to implement a hybrid cloud approach.
Yep, absolutely. If I may, one risk that we haven't talked about, which I think is actually a really big one, is the talent and resources able to do some of these roles that we're talking about, especially when you're thinking about architecting a hybrid solution, making those decisions about where do you store your data. I like to think about setting up data services and thinking about SLAs. If you are deploying an analytical solution that's taking in streaming data and running some computation that's rather complex and then pushing it back out, from soup to nuts, from beginning to end, you really have a lot of questions about storage, processing, compute, how to optimize all of those things. And the talent around the folks that do that kind of work is it's very limited, it's scarce. There's a lot of colleges now offering degrees, advanced degrees in data science and things of this nature, computer engineering, but even in the commercial sector, these resources are limited. I know part of the president's management agenda is to sort of create this workforce for the 21st century, but public sector is struggling to get these type of resources. So that has to be, in a data strategy in an organization. The C-level suite, they need to really think about how they're going to acquire those resources and be very mindful with it and have a game plan in place.
Sure, and I think if you talk to a lot of CIOs, they would say that they want to get as out of the operations business as much as they can, and divert the money they spend on lots of resources to operate the environment to resources who have those skills. And so how do you lower your operational costs? So cloud might be a way in some cases. Automation is a way. You were talking about all the storage that's required. Moving to a software-defined approach to storage, I think, is a way to lower cost over time as well. In software-defined approaches, you're really separating the software that manages the hardware from the hardware itself. It allows you to utilize commodity hardware or repurpose hardware in your environment. So you can take some of the cost out of buying storage systems from the large storage vendors, possibly. So I think that there's a role for those newer technologies and approaches that if very progressive CIOs are listening to this, they can think about how do I integrate a software-defined approach to storage or networking or some of these other really critical core infrastructure aspects of their job. And as you do that and you take cost out of those pieces, if you can maintain that budget, now you can apply it to other resources and be more strategic. Every CIO wants to move from being the person that is known for operating IT and making sure that the phones work and the computers work to the person who has a real seat at the table with leadership, talking about how do we achieve the mission of this agency. And demonstrating that you can take cost out of the equation and free up money for those mission-focused activities is absolutely a way to get a seat at the table and be able to be a participant in those conversations.
Absolutely.
Let me go back into the government side. We touched upon that briefly, but that, of course, is a major aspect of everything that's going on here. How does the President's management agenda help or hinder the process to overcome the challenges associated with these increasingly complex environments?
Yeah. Well, I think the PMA is a very well-written document. And if you just look at the first two cap goals around IT modernization and using data as a strategic asset, those two things alone, if we were able to focus on them inside our agencies and drive to more modern architectures, utilizing cloud, utilizing software-defined approaches, set the stage to use the data strategically. It doesn't get you there by itself. You need all of the focus that we were describing in the beginning, I think, around governance and around data classification and understanding your data. The federal data strategy, I think, is an important component of this. But those two ideas, that we're going to modernize our infrastructure, we're going to modernize our systems, we're going to focus on data. Sherry already mentioned the workforce for the 21st century. Those things create a government that's ready to engage with citizens in a very meaningful and value-added way, in my opinion.
Yeah, excuse me. I absolutely agree with everything you said. I would add a couple of things. The visibility that it's brought with regards to the importance of setting up a data organization within federal agencies, I think is really positive. So the transparency of data has led to a number of really positive events, creating a federal data strategy and a data maturity model. Many of these things have existed in the private sector for many years, but having a cross-functional group across many agencies come together and talk about creating a data strategy and seeking public comment is a great thing. It's providing a lot of education and setting out a data maturity model that's sort of written in public sector sort of language and socialized around the agencies is critical. And it gives something for each agency to sort of wrap their hands around and start to have discussions about it. The Open Government Data Act was just signed by the President, which is a great thing. It was passed by the House and Senate last year. And that actually mandates that every agency hire a non-political CDO. So that's really exciting news for us.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
Where do you think the CDO should report in an agency?
Where it should report?
Yeah.
I do actually think CDO is a rather strategic position. It needs to be in a place where whoever is driving the reins of what actually happens in an agency, that person needs to be, lockstep with that individual. As we know, creating these cultures where data is, people are excited about data, they know it's critical in terms of creating analytical solutions that help drive better decision making. It changes the culture. People's jobs will change. You're bringing new people in through SIs or hiring a couple of folks who are actually going to be sort of managing these things internally. And so the whole process of setting up the data strategy and the governance and all of that, it's really to be mindful and to think about how to make that most successful is to think about how to do it in a way where you're bringing people along.
Yeah.
And educating.
I thought about where the CDO should report in a number of different instances. I had this conversation, and I've had the CDO report to me, but I think that the CDO is actually better off reporting outside of IT and having the CDO maybe report to a deputy secretary or someone very high that cuts across the whole of the agency.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that.
I think it's also important that we think about ways that we separate the data from the technology.
Yeah.
Right.
It's operations oriented. It's very connected to the business, right? The running the agency.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the data exists in the programs. The programs are creating and collecting data all day long, and I feel like if the CDO and data responsibility sit in IT, they can maybe not have the act as if they have the true ownership of that data and responsibility around its stewardship and its protection, care, its quality. So putting the CDO at a place that has agency-wide reach feels to me to be a better approach.
Yep.
And having the CDO be a very strategic, as you said, creates a different mentality around data. And IT, the CIO, that organization is going to be responsible for the fundamental aspects, right? Being able to create an IT infrastructure where data can be stored securely, where it's protected, where you can move it between environments or move it from one cloud to the other. Be having good mobility and opportunity to find and access that data and use it. But those things are, in my opinion, separate from how you use it and what you're trying to get out of it. They're all part of the strategy you talked about, right? And roles and responsibilities, again, I think that was really great when you said that, because it's really key for the organization to think about it holistically. Because also HR is going to have a role, and the chief privacy officer is going to have a role, and general counsel is going to have a role. Maybe procurement will have a role too in some way. And it really requires a cross-functional team to come together in some kind of data governance council, if you will, or some overarching organization, maybe chaired by the CDO or a deputy secretary type.
I think obviously the CDO and a CTO, CIO, they're close partners. They need to be linked together pretty tightly. But the best ROI out of data is when you're looking at data across systems, as you know. So IT is in the business of managing applications, making decisions about performance, these sorts of things, keeping the plumbing going, right? Not just the phones and the computers up and stuff of that nature, but the use of data and having a vision for how all the data that an organization uses can be leveraged to provide better services, to create new products, give visibility to things people never thought they could see is super important. And the only way that can really be done successfully is to understand at a very high level everything that's going on in the organization. So having that high level visibility is actually super, super important. That's understanding the mission, the different departments, what key processes are running, how you can optimize those processes, especially when you were talking about automating a lot of decision processes. We haven't talked about AI, machine learning, and these sorts of things. Everybody's really excited about getting there, but we don't have our, as you said, data house in order, and those things are fundamentally first need to be dealt with before we get into that level of automation. But you need to understand those business processes. And not a lot of folks talk about business process. It's kind of, it's not terribly sexy. It's boring. Venn diagrams and process roadmaps are not exciting, but they're super key, and they can add a lot of leverage when designing or optimizing how to make processes better and how data fits into that process.
Something related to that is about where you get the data. So the chief data officer or that team, they need access to data so they can do great things with it and make decisions and automate things. And one of the things that I've been hearing as I've met with different IT leaders is getting that data can be harder than it needs to be. But some see opportunity to expedite that process through unifying their data protection and using the copies of data that get created through a backup and recovery process as the source for those those data sets that are used to drive decisions. So instead of having to go to IT and or different program owners to get data, go to the secondary storage, go to the secondary data, and use that as the basis for those analytics. And it can really streamline your processes and give you much faster access to those data sets. And then the copies that you make in order to have a good data protection program actually have more value than they might in a circumstance where you're only using them in the case of a disaster. So, or the case of the need to recover. So there's a lot of opportunity, I think, when you think about your environment and the related capabilities that make up the large idea of data management. There's a lot of opportunity when you think about it holistically and you think about it in a way that you know what end you're trying to create. And if you're trying to create an environment where data is honored and used to make decisions, you almost have to work backwards to figure out how do you get that data and how do you get it in a very efficient way to people that need it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
We've been discussing a lot of the challenges. Let's start leaning toward the solutions, although we've touched on a few. The IT Modernization Act, is that a good path to a solution for many of the challenges you've discussed?
I do think it's necessary, and there's a lot of good work that's already begun in the public sector using that to leverage instigating new projects and getting funding and things of that nature. Certainly most visible to many folks is agencies migrating to the cloud. The one thing I will say about having legislation like that and the Open Data Government Act are that there's uniform across the federal public sector agencies doing this together. And this Open Data Government Act, as an example, when CDOs are hired, there's going to be a council. There's a million different directions everyone could take in terms of modernizing and how to leverage data and the architecture and the solutions they create. But there's real power in actually people sharing best practice, right? And if we want to think about how to spend our tax dollars wisely, we don't need 500 flavors of how to create an architecture for providing some of the same services. And if indeed there is a goal to actually make data open to the public sector, across the public sector, sharing data, that's another thing we should talk about, agencies sharing data, but make it open to stakeholders in the commercial sector. We need to think about how consistently agencies can do that. And so I'm excited about all the collaboration that will take place. And hopefully some good proof of concepts and pilots can be created that there's a lot of learnings that can be shared, and people across different agencies are utilizing those learnings.
I think those are great points. The opportunity to modernize systems and money that may come from the Modernization Board or through a working capital fund, it's really important that money is targeted at things that are strategic, that drive the mission forward. But you can't do those projects and programs properly if you haven't thought about the data. As we were getting ready for this, I think, Sherry, you said it's all about the data. It's always about the data.
It's always about the data.
So I think that's an easy answer to fall back on here. I think it's a good thing if there's a effort to take a look at the data and understand what it is, make sure that it's properly managed and can be ultimately used to help drive agency decision making.
Okay, it's all about the data.
It is.
But where do you start applying that philosophy in a way that will make the solutions that we need most of all in this challenging era?
Well, I'll just begin by saying IT, the CIO can't do it alone. I think we spoke earlier, and you were very eloquent when you talked about the need for a data council and a roles and responsibilities, a cross-functional team. I think that's where those conversations begin. If the CIO or if the chief data officer is buried inside the CIO organization and they're trying to push these things, the programs where the money is will typically push back and say, you're getting in the way of our operation, or we don't see the value. When you have the larger conversation, the broader community inside an agency can see the value in data and see the value in some of these foundational data management capabilities, and they see the opportunity to enhance the mission, to drive things forward, to make good decisions, evidence-based decision making, like we're talking about in the Open Government Act. That's when I think that I become very optimistic that the organization can do the things they need to do to be in a position to do great things with their data.
Yeah, I would concur. I think some of these things that need to be done, they're cultural changes for sure. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Folks I've met in the public sector and talked with, there's a lot of antiquated systems, right? People are still writing in COBOL, and there's still mainframes, and so and the people behind those systems and those programming languages are still perhaps need retraining or retooling, and just starting to use data where perhaps anecdotes and intuition, was what drove decision making. Changing to a data-driven culture will take time. That said, too, the CDO roles, I know in many agencies right now, that role is just there for 2 to 3 years. That is not actually a lot of time to actually get a lot of work done. The thing I'm excited about is these roles, as mandated by the Act that's just been signed, is they're non-political. So hopefully that means that folks will stay in those roles a little longer to actually get something accomplished. But where to start is always very interesting, and I think it always goes back to looking at every agency has a strategic roadmap. There are things that they're trying to accomplish in the near term, perhaps a little longer term. We know we have budgets that take us out 10, 20 years. That's crazy. What's happening in the world of data is changing, year by year. The way I have part of what I love about my job is I actually get to talk to a lot of startup companies, these AI companies, 25-year-olds who are creating some really cool technology. And the way they start envisioning what their platform looks like, just the user interface that they present. I know these things are going to change, in 6 months' time. They have product roadmaps, adding more functionality. So we need to think about what are those key things that can add value and get started on them right away, but start small. You cannot boil the ocean. Right. So start small, show success, and bring everybody in your organization along with you to see what that proof of concept pilot is, socialize the results. If there's learnings, if something didn't work right, that's okay. That's a learning too.
Right, and when you think about the CBO role as it's still new in some places, I think it goes through phases. Phase one is understanding what data you have, right, across the organization. My experience, a lot of that turns into open data requirements, and we have this data, we can put some of this on data.gov, or we can share some data, and you begin to create a repository and an understanding about what it is. As you dig deeper, in phase two, you start to see, okay, we have a lot of data across systems or organizations where we're tracking the same thing, but we call it different names, we're managing it differently. And then you start asking, what's the system of record? Why does the data not match up? Sometimes someone will say, you'll ask a business question, and the answer will be, well, it depends what system you look in. Because the definition is really, really important when you're talking about, a business topic. And phase two is you begin to have organization-wide conversations about how do we want to define this certain thing. What do we want to call a customer? Who is the customer? And how do they interact with us? And how do we record those interactions? And the same customer interacts with my agency and your agency, but we think about that person as two different people. How do we get to the point where we start to, in kind of a phase three perhaps, integrate either those systems or the data in those systems so that customer has one identity to our organization? And a phase four, as you continue on, is now you have all this data. How do we use that to maybe predict what that customer needs from us and how we interact with them? And I think it kind of goes on from there, but it comes back to what we started in the beginning. What data do we have globally across this organization? Let's understand it from a technical perspective, that you ask the questions about, well, where is the data, and who can access it? Who do we share it with? How do they secure it? Do we need all the data? You're asking these questions at a lower level of detail, but asking those questions and getting that foundational understanding, I think, is just so critical. And it's hard for me to conceive of another place to start when an organization hasn't had a culture of data stewardship in the past.
Yeah. I agree with everything you said in the sense of kind of the phasing notion. But the one thing I would point out, and this is what I think folks can sometimes get stuck on, is when I say boil the ocean, if you take a key initiative and you follow through all those phases and demonstrate how the process works, because I look at it, I'm process oriented, but I think that sort of taking one step at a time and demonstrating success. So if you go in, the Army has over 636 systems, right? Huge. A lot of redundant data there, many legacy systems. In conversation with Tom Sasala, that need to be sunsetted. the way to go about doing that, I'm a big advocate, is having a key project that starts to demonstrate each of those phases that you demonstrated. Because just to go in and catalog every single system that you have, and then you start to see the redundancy,
Right.
that
So
gets a little...
Pick a program maybe,
Right.
or
Yeah. So
or a capability.
A program, yeah.
Yeah.
And then several initiatives
I think it's a
maybe
great
within
point.
that. So, and there's to your point about cataloging and collecting metadata and all those sorts of things. There's so many good enterprise applications out there right now that many in the federal agencies are using right now. So there's good architecture that and products that have been out for many, many years that people can start to use and leverage. And they have lots of experience in the federal sector. So yeah, lots of opportunity.
Yeah.
Well, let's go from metadata to metaphysical.
Ooh.
What kind of solutions, what type of solutions are likely to have a greater impact? The macro solutions that overarch the entire data management realm, or micro solutions that address specific needs and can be put in immediately? And you can't answer both.
How about it depends?
Yeah, it depends. Next question.
Depends is good. Tell us what it depends on.
I think in general, solutions that are integrated, that cut across the domains of data management, from data protection to data portability and storage optimization, governance, business continuity. An integrated set of solutions is going to provide more value over the long term.
Yep.
When you have a number of, every organization has to do those things. And if you're doing those things using a number of different products and you're doing those things using solutions that are not integrated, you're missing opportunity. So going a little bit slower to go fast in the end by maybe integrating a solution set from the start to ensure you have strong data management will pay long-term dividends, and you'll be able to operate in a more efficient manner over the long term. I'm very confident of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Automation will save money,
Right.
reduce expense, also create greater accuracy and quality and all those sorts of things. The one thing I would add is, there's a call to use AI, and AI can be used to automate a lot of things in machine learning, and they are great. And there's a lot of skepticism about the black box, and we need to open the black box, and all those things I actually agree with. When I look at looking at some of the technologies that do some of this, they're very specific, and the requirements that they cover are rather narrow, can be. So the depends would come in depending on what exactly you're trying to accomplish in terms of that on the analysis side and sort of automating through an AI lens. I'm a big fan, I'll say this again, of piloting something to gain the confidence and the security and make sure the quality's there. And so in that regard, I think the process of deploying something, even in a pilot, it's kind of an agile process, and it enables integration of other services that you can bring to that. So does that make sense?
Yes.
And so I'm a big fan of taking that, especially with some of these technologies are so new, they will add a lot of value. But we don't have a lot of experience utilizing them in certainly the federal civilian area.
You've mentioned AI. AI is the elephant in the room. How will AI best help provide a solution to better data management?
I think there's a few ways. If you look at, if you have a lot of customers and you're able to look across those customers, you can see trends. Then when you align similar customers, you can say customer A has experienced this kind of data growth over a period of time. They're in this industry and they interact with customers in this way. Your company, your organization is similar. You should expect similar kind of data growth. So I can plan for that, right? I can have a capacity conversation with you early on about when you should buy more storage, perhaps, or how you should leverage the cloud, or how you can take advantage of what other organizations have experienced over time. And I can use machine learning and AI capabilities to really fine-tune that conversation with the customer. And to me, that's very exciting. As someone who used to be in the position where I was buying a lot of technology, you're making guesses about what you're going to need, and you're not always spending your money as efficiently as possible. I think you can be much better prepared for that conversation, both as the customer and as the provider. So that's one opportunity that I see.
So in my experience, sort of being a data officer and also a data scientist, you're always excited about new data. And definitely with the advent of AI, machine learning, what that does, and now our ability to store data and process it in ways we've never been able to, all these technological innovations over the last couple of decades. So we're actually able to get new data that we've never been able to analyze and utilize to provide better services, to increase customer satisfaction, create new products. And so from that vantage point, we're able to create new assets and better assets. But with that sometimes does come, more challenges in terms of how do you enable quality and storage and things of this nature. But so there's a new horizon, if you will, about what we're able to do now. And that, I think, is a good thing. Utilizing these technologies they'll lead to automation, they'll lead to new services and new ways of doing things. And all of that, when we think again sort of about how we are utilizing taxpayer dollars, I think it bodes well for the future. Again, sort of education is really key. Creating a culture that embraces that is really super important. And attracting people to actually do these type of functions for the government is really key as well.
At what point in data migration, which is an ongoing endeavor, at what point should large organizations start depending on AI?
That's a good question. I think it comes down to when do they feel comfortable that they can trust the machine to do the same work as a human.
Will they ever feel comfortable?
Yeah, I think ultimately, eventually, just the same thing that we've experienced with other technologies that we rely on. That years ago you wouldn't think this computer, this machine could do something for me. It's an evolution that will occur over time, and as there are good positive results, I think people will adopt to these things, especially as they see other organizations have good results. If you think about the Moneyball scenario and the Oakland Athletics, when they had a new approach to recruit, to fielding a baseball team, and they were successful, other organizations adopted the same approach. You'll see it in other aspects of business and commerce and government, I suspect.
Yeah, it's going to allow people to do their jobs better and more effectively. That said, there's a lot of focus on, AI is we're not going to need humans to do certain jobs anymore. I don't think about it that way so much. I think about it's going to make people be able to do a better job and take away some of the rote type of work that, you can't just throw another body at some of these things, especially in the security realm. Being able to automate, images and what are objects, right? Or text analysis, for security purposes. There's just not enough people you could, throw at certain problem sets, right? So I tend to take a positive view about that, and that it's going to actually make folks their life easier at the end of the day from a work perspective.
Don't you think AI will lead to a huge growth in databases because people will suddenly discover that they can absorb more data and process it to produce
AI will produce vastly more data. You're absolutely right. And all that data will have to get managed, right? Mm-hmm. It's this circular thing. The AI is only as good as the data that the machine learns from. But AI produces more data. So it's this cycle and
virtuous cycle.
Virtuous cycle, thank you. But at the core is data management. It's all of the things we've been talking about today. If you can do all those things well, I think you're well positioned as an organization to really benefit from AI sooner than others.
Agree.
Okay. Going back to the solution, let me do an all-encompassing question here. What do you think is the area where organizations must pay the closest attention to seek solutions as they move forward? This is encompassing everything we've discussed.
Data visibility. Finding where their data is stored, what data they have, how long they've kept it, how long they need it. Getting that under control is, in my opinion, the most important thing an organization can do.
Sherry?
I agree that cataloging is super important, partially because it's a good thing to know what you have if you don't know and where it's located. I also believe that it facilitates conversations that probably haven't been started in an organization to understand who's using this data, what is it used for, and some of those conversations help you realize that some assets can be archived, put away, others need to be available on a SLA that's immediate or near real term for reporting purposes and these sorts of things. So I agree that is super critical, and that does also bring about some education about what the data is, how it's being utilized, and brings visibility, hopefully, across agencies as well, across different departments, because that's what I see is most critical. To get value out of data, you have to have agencies sharing data, and to really get, from an ROI perspective, and just creating better services across agencies.
And that's going to reinforce the need to make this a cross-functional conversation, because you can't share data unless the general counsel is aware that you're sharing that data.
Yep.
Sometimes you might have to inform Congress that you're sharing data in a certain way. Certainly, there could be HR implications or procurement implications or other things. So you need that data governance committee that we talked about in the beginning. And that's really part, finding your data and those kinds of requirements around governance, really tie in together.
Absolutely.
So, I think you said it well again. Having a cross-functional conversation that encompasses all aspects of the organization and understanding what you're trying to accomplish.
Yep.
Begin with the end in mind, and know what you're going to be doing with this data as you understand it. Those are really foundational steps. Everything else we've talked about is a means to that end.
Yeah, getting rid of the silos. They're everywhere, right? And for good reasons. Everything's an evolution, to your point. And having a CDO, creating data governance, some roles and responsibilities, talking about the data, understanding how it can be leveraged to solve really important problems. The opioid crisis is an example of all the good research across CDC, NIH, and others to really give visibility into a crisis, the causes, the implications, solutions to mitigate it. That's really important. And some of those conversations and solutions are going to be best had by looking across agencies.
I'd like each of you to gaze into the crystal ball that each of you must have somewhere. What would you think is the greatest potential pitfall that organizations could find themselves facing if they don't pay attention to some of the basic tenets you've looked at in terms of data protection and data management? Jonathan, I'll hit you with that first.
Sure. In the event of a breach, your organization is infiltrated by a bad guy, and you begin to lose data, and you are unable to tell your customers, the citizens that are interacting with your agency, what data you've lost, or you say we've been breached and it's this many records, and then as you do some more forensics, you find out, because you don't know what data you have in your environment and where it is, that it's more data, then it's more data, then it's more data. The trust really erodes at that point. I think that you're not necessarily judged the fact that there was a breach. They're very common, and you see them routinely reported. But you are judged about how you respond to that breach. And if you're unable to provide good information back about what happened, your reputation can really take a hit. So if you understand your data and you understand where it is and what it is, you can respond in a much better manner and faster, and do the things that you need to do to restore trust with your customers.
Sherry?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think the security thing is super important and real, right? Data getting corrupted, even people changing data or putting data in that wasn't part of a system, that can also happen. I think organizations that don't sort of modernize and move into the people say data 3.0, data 4.0, depending on who you talk to, they're going to be left behind and not be able to provide services and that they are expected to provide. There's not really a choice not to move forward, in my opinion. The type of services and expectations that we as taxpayer and citizens have about how the world works and how we're communicated with, and the type of services, the immediacy with which you want updates and alerts and triggers and things of this nature, all of that requires that you go through a digital transformation, that you are taking the steps to do the proper due diligence about your data, how it's stored, managed, the SLA around those services. These are things that we don't really have a choice not to move forward, from my perspective. So I think there's a lot of great leaders out there and people with these expertise, and they're excited to join in and help as best they can, and help agencies modernize.
All right then. Well, that concludes our Signal Magazine webinar for today. I want to thank our two experts for their presentation, and thanks to all of you for joining us. You can continue to link to the archived version of this webinar, along with previous Signal webinars, on the Signal Magazine website at www.afcea.org/signal/webinar. Thank you again, and have a good day.